Добро пожаловать. Welcome. The Russians are a very welcoming people, even if their leader is not always. And it's a great pleasure to have our guest speaker today, Karen Dawisha, who has recently come out with a book, Putin's Kleptocracy. I can do the Russian, I can't do the English. Putin's Kleptocracy, Who Owns Russia? She is the Walter E. Havighurst Professor of Political Science in the Department of Political Science at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and the director of the university's Havighurst Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies. She received her PhD from the London School of Economics in 1975. Her book has been attracting a lot of attention. I thought you might like to hear a few reviews of the book before she speaks to us personally. One is from the New York Times Book Review, a copiously researched account, the most persuasive account we have of corruption in contemporary Russia. Dawisha won't be getting a Russian visa anytime soon, something we were just talking about over here with my wife, who's Russian, and with Cynthia's Professor Simmons. Her indictment, even if it wouldn't stand up in a court of law, hits Putin where it really hurts. Another is from The Economist, a who's who of the people on the sanctions list drawn up by America and the EU. It is also a guide to the crony capitalism that grew out of the nexus of Mr. Putin's plutocratic interests, his shady past, and authoritarian rule. And then last, a longtime Russia scholar, this from the Financial Times, Dawisha spent almost 8 years researching her book. In studying high-level corruption under the Putin regime, Dawisha does a thorough job of analyzing the relevant material in the historical archives and court records and collating reports in the Russian and Western press. The power of her argument is amplified by the coolness of her prose. And I, in particular, am interested in hearing what is the difference between A, a plutocrat, and B, an oligarch. But hopefully that's something you could touch on in your talk. So, Professor Dawisha, thank you very much. Pleasure to have you.
So, can you hear me? I think I really need to have this on for them. I'm going to move all these liquids. If anybody needs anything, please feel free to grab. Well, I gather that the lecture was advertised just as a lecture on the subject of Putin. And I think it really demonstrates the power of this person, that anybody would come to a lecture where there's a sitting political leader, and that's all that's promised. I mean, how many people would go to Obama or to Bush or to Blair or to anybody? I mean, I think it speaks to the fascination that we all have with this person. And the fascination we have is certainly shared with the Russian people, who are fed a pablum of Putin 24/7 on state-controlled Russian television. And as a result of that, they have, I would say, truly drunk the Kool-Aid. And 85% approval ratings for him, which don't ever ask, any sitting president of the United States when they're going to reach 85, much less 45% approval rating. So it's a pretty fascinating situation. People often ask whether I've met him, and the answer to that is yes. And I'll tell you a little bit about the story of meeting him, because I think it really speaks to how many of you know what the word simulacrum is? Hey, so to the whole kind of creation of this huge myth around Putin, that what matters is not so much Putin the man, but Putin the creation. And so I was with a group of Western scholars and Western journalists who gather annually, paid for by the Kremlin, and you get a very long meeting with him, 4 or 5 hours, and you get to meet other political leaders. That year the subject was the leadership of political parties, so we got to meet all the political party leaders. It was about a 5-day meeting. And, you know, he keeps everybody waiting. That's part of his, you know, I'm the more powerful, so I'm going to keep you waiting. Everybody's waiting, and everybody's sort of lined up waiting. And then he comes in, and he shakes everybody's hand. He's got his brown Labrador with him, probably checking for marijuana or something. And then the next day, and this was a feature of every press event that we went to in which he was there, and subsequent years as well. The next day, the press covered his meeting with these people and pictured him shaking the hands of the shortest person there, which wasn't even me. So, I mean, he's about an inch taller than I am. And that was not enough of a gap for the Russian press. And I think it's just a really good example of the importance that the press attaches to his person. And when we talk about Putin, because you're all here to listen to a lecture on Putin, we're talking about somebody who is very invested in, and the Kremlin apparatus is very invested in, the embodiment of his power. You know, the shirtlessness, the swimming, the horseback riding, the kind of Mussolini-like fascination with physical culture. And so, at least until Crimea was taken, there was not really an ideology of Putinism except for Putin. Now that may be sadly changing, because I don't think Putinism, except for the corruption aspect of it, was very damaging. Could be that we're into a phase that's much more damaging. So when we talk about the damaging aspects, and that's really what I'm going to focus on today, one of the things that's quite interesting is that a year ago, a little over a year ago, when the crisis in Crimea started, Crimea, a peninsula off the coast of southern Ukraine, the West responded. Now, any of us who has studied Cold War foreign policy knows that Soviet-American conflict in the Cold War involved the movement of military hardware, whether it was tanks or ships or men being put on alert or whatever. But this time, the Western response to what was a military takeover by Russia was the imposition of sanctions immediately. And we all know how Washington works, so we all know that they had been watching this story develop. They had decided to announce publicly what they already had determined, not privately, but within the government, that this is a regime which at its core is based on world historic thievery, predation. And if you want to hit it, you don't move something through the Dardanelles into the Black Sea, a ship. You grab the money in the banks, or you try to find the money in the banks. You impose sanctions. And you impose sanctions on those people who are close to a unnamed in the official sanctions list, senior Russian government official, obviously Vladimir Putin. So they identified his circle, even in the sanctions announcement, they called it a cabal. I mean, I was just writing, finishing my book, trying to get my book published, and I never used the word cabal in that book. I was like, damn, the US government is using the word cabal. Let's put the word cabal in the book. So it was an interesting timing, and I think I obviously did a lot of research for the book, and I'm very pleased that it's gotten all this attention, but there's nothing that helps a book like US government sanctions, I have to say. When my friends say, how did you do that? I was like, US government sanctions. Because people saw the sanctions, the book then at that point got refused publication by Cambridge University Press. There was a big brouhaha about it in the British and American media, and then it got snapped up by Simon & Schuster, and they brought it out within 4 months. It's crazy. And it really explains who these people are, who this cabal is. And so this is really the story of that cabal, like who they are, how they got together. It's like the inside story of some kind of secret fraternity. Maybe less drinking than most American fraternities, but still it's a fraternity for sure. So this group started, and I'll just to finish up on the subject of why I did this book. I actually didn't set out to write this book. I set out to write a book on trying to find the answer to the question, when did these guys, when did they decide to do what clearly they have done, which is to build an authoritarian regime? You know, in Western political science literature, and any of you who are taking political science classes will know about democratization theory and all that. We focus so much, in my own writing too, on transitions to democracy. And all the 90s was taken up with a lot of very optimistic, deterministic ideas about the end of history. And that communism has fallen, there's only one path, and Russia is on it. And, you know, just keep watching and we're going to see democracy come. That was the idea. And so a lot of focus on elections and party building and what comes first, privatization or democratization, but they're both going to come, so it's a very interesting experiment. Well, it didn't happen. And so then suddenly you have this academic literature starting to talk about, you know, pitfalls on the road to democracy, the crisis of democracy. Well, I decided, what about an alternative hypothesis? How about testing the hypothesis? Did they ever want to get on the road to democracy? Did the people who are now in power ever want to have a democracy? In the sense of, did they want to establish a system in which they could lose power? Right? That's the sine qua non. If you're not willing to rotate elites, then I don't care what kind of decoration you're putting on this, it's not a democracy. You have to be willing to rotate elites. So clearly when we saw the 2008 castling, the switch between Medvedev and Putin, that was a very obvious signal. 2012 was completely and utterly stolen, the 11/12. So much so that there were riots in the street, demonstrations in the street, lots of arrests. So working back from that, I was like, okay, so not 2011-12, not 2007-8, not 2004-5, and then or 3-4, and then I was like, okay, 2000, the first election of Putin. Was it clean or was it dirty? And it was really dirty. There is no doubt in my mind, and I spend a lot of time in the book going into chapter and verse, that no matter how you do it, whether you use mathematical modeling, statistical methods, or anecdotal complaints, legal cases, that the 2000 election in which Putin won by 2 million votes, he avoided a second round runoff. He won in the first round by 2 million votes. Many more votes than 2 million were stolen. So, of course, he may have won had he gone to the second round, but he didn't want to go to the second round. He wanted to win in the first round, and he wanted to win in the first round so much that he stole it. It was stolen for him. It wasn't just him. So then I was really faced with this, like, you know, I'm sure you've all had this situation where you start writing a paper and you're like, okay, I know how this is going to work. And you get all the evidence and you start reading it. And you even know what the conclusion is going to be. All you need to do is just write the thing, right? And then suddenly it's like, you know what? this is not the right conclusion. This evidence does not support this. So I was faced with this harsh realization that this regime was never intended by those who are now in power to be democratic. That's my argument. Okay, so where did they come from, and what kind of nastiness did they get up to? Now, first of all, there are some good things that happened in Russia, and there's some good things that Putin did. So I'm not going to say that everything that he did was from the very beginning only heading the country towards some kind of massive dictatorship. For example, Procter & Gamble, which is headquartered in Cincinnati, Ohio. And by the way, there's spring in Cincinnati, and it's going to be here in 4 days. I just left it this morning, so just have patience. Procter & Gamble, headquartered in Cincinnati, the very first agreement that they had in Russia was signed by Vladimir Putin when he was in the Department for International Relations at Leningrad State University. So Procter & Gamble signed an agreement with somebody who was in charge of study abroad, the equivalent. Can you even imagine this in the United States? It's simply impossible to imagine. But in Leningrad, this is before it became renamed St. Petersburg, here you have, suddenly there's a revolution, and who controls this office? Well, Vladimir Putin decided he controlled it, and he gave it to Procter & Gamble. And Procter & Gamble today does annually $6 billion worth of business in Russia.
Wasn't it Anatoly Sobchak who done it?
No. Putin's name is on the signature. It's a signature on the document.
That's what officially was announced at the time, that it was Sobchak's decision and his agreement.
You're right in this sense.
Would you repeat the question?
Wasn't okay? So at this, we're talking about a difference of 6 months. So Putin, when he was head of the International Relations Department of Leningrad State University, Soviet Union still existed. Sobchak wasn't there. So they started this arrangement with Procter & Gamble through Putin, and Putin's name is on these original agreement with Leningrad State University. Very quickly, Soviet Union collapsed. Sobchak became mayor. Even before that, he was signing things. And Procter & Gamble got a bigger agreement with the city, and Sobchak signed that. I mean, you were working there. So there's a really interesting whole book on this called Russian Tide, written by the person who brought Tide. They in order to buy the loyalty of the cynical Russian faculty everywhere is cynical, they gave them free little boxes of Tide. So, it came at a small price.
Take a question here.
Sure.
Could you actually use the microphone so that we can see it?
Thank you. I wondered if you plan to cover his rise to power. It's been said that he became adopted by Yeltsin at some point after he was an acquaintance of Sobchak.
Yeah.
And that in return for a promise to protect Yeltsin and his family, that he was favored by Yeltsin to be his successor. Do you think that is true? And if so, how would you know things like that? I'm curious about the sources in such a closed society that would allow you to find out things of that.
Sure. So there are two periods in Putin's rise. His St. Petersburg-based period and his Moscow-based period. So the early 90s, until 1996, he was based in St. Petersburg. And then Sobchak, the mayor, lost power, and Putin, moved to Moscow and became part of the presidential administration. I'll continue the story, but I'll answer the second part. How do you know this? Well, in the 1990s, there was free Russian press. There was free press. I mean, really free press. Much freer than we're accustomed to in this country, where you turn on ABC and it's the same news you just watched on CBS. I mean real fights in the media. So, you know, there are, you have to decide through knowing people and making your own decision which of these sources you want to give credence to. But I couldn't write probably this book today. But then it was a completely different situation. All right, so the early 1990s, Putin becomes the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. And he starts to build around him interlocking circles of trusted aides. So one group was the KGB, his old buddies from the KGB. One group were liberals, especially liberal economists, who, like Putin, were in favor of privatization. Not necessarily democratization, but privatization. And business. And then let's just put this up here, because this will come up in later. Moscow-based elites, people close to Yeltsin, like that. And he really is the only one who had a foot in all of these camps. Obviously, these economists were not going to be on the same page as the KGB, because they were surveilled by these people from the late 60s onward. Business in Russian, and I mean it in that way, I mean really what we would call mafia. And Putin was very involved with mafia. Now, this is a horrible thing to say about any leader, but what is very clear is that Putin sought portfolios for himself in in St. Petersburg politics, which would maximize his power, particularly in the economic realm. So, for example, he was the head of the Department for Foreign Economic Relations. That meant that no company, Western company, like Procter & Gamble, could come in and establish a business without him approving of their business plans and where they were going to get a building. Because remember, up until 1991, all of this was the Soviet Union. It was all state-owned property. There wasn't private property. So there was a process of grabbing that took place, and it's not like people were buying as a result of reading the personal column, you know, this building for sale. No, somebody controlled these buildings, and you needed a network of influence in order to gain access to be able to use that building. And once you are using it, then maybe after a little while you would own it through a miraculous intervention. So Putin was the one who licensed foreign companies to come into St. Petersburg. He was the one who gave permission for goods and services to be exported abroad. He could open the border. Remember, in the Soviet Union, you couldn't just be a trader and go abroad and sell stuff. You couldn't be a person in charge of a private refinery and sell your oil on the international energy markets. That oil was owned by the state. And yet suddenly, beginning in 1991, contracts were given with Putin's signature for the export of hundreds and thousands of barrels of oil, plus rare earth minerals, plus gas, plus cotton from Uzbekistan. I mean, there was a whole, just think about this, 11 time zones full of raw materials, and one of the major terminuses, or termini, is St. Petersburg, out through the Baltic. So a lot of stuff was flooding into St. Petersburg, and how to open that border. Putin could open the border. He signed thousands and thousands of contracts to approve export abroad. And when he became deputy mayor in 1991, there was anybody in St. Petersburg in 1991 or in the Soviet Union? 92. And it was very tough winter. There was a real fear of hunger. And let me tell you, that is a feeling they know very well. So it's politically crippling, destabilizing in society to have people feel that their government is going to be incapable of providing food. So there was a food crisis, and it was agreed that the border would be open and stuff would go out in exchange for food. And the border was open, Putin signed all these contracts, the border was open and no food came back. And a minimum of $122 million of contracts were signed over Putin's signature for items that went out for barter, but did not produce goods that came back. And this led to an investigation by the St. Petersburg Parliament. Marina Salye was in charge of the group that investigated. They gave their report to the city's parliament, and the parliament voted to accept it and called by name for the removal of Putin, by name, in the beginning of 1992. But he wasn't removed. So that's where this kind of circles, competing circles, became very important. He was obviously very effective, quiet, not making any waves, not hiding his KGB connections, in fact. And also, I would say, beginning in 1992, beginning to use a private security firm called Baltic Escort. Baltic Escort. So imagine the Soviet Union collapses. There's thousands and thousands, maybe 100,000 former KGB people who are no longer needed, excess to requirements. And what are they going to do? So one of the things they did was to form private security firms. So this guy, Zola Tov, there were actually two of them, but I'm not going to talk about the other one. They formed a private security firm. And Putin hired a private security firm to provide security for him. And think about this. So I know this would never happen in Boston, so let's just talk generically about Chicago. So let's just imagine Chicago, in which Mayor Rahm Emanuel, when he gets into his car, he's not accompanied by the city police. He's accompanied by private individuals. And the press picked up on this, the St. Petersburg press picked up on this, and they made several of them made the statement that Baltic Escort is responsible for taking care of tasks that lawful security firms could not undertake. Putin had the portfolio for gambling. And so he brought gambling under city control. And those journalists who were following this in the 90s talked about how Baltic Escort took the skim. We all know what that means, right? You want to be open, you want to stay open, you want to stay open that extra hour, this is what it's going to cost you. They took the skim. And they made sure everything was legitimate in the sense of, everybody's having a nice time, nobody's killing each other inside the casino, very Las Vegas. So, and probably more or less the same kind of setup. So they put order down on something, but in the meantime, they were also taking a cut. And I don't say in the book, and I don't say now, that Putin personally was taking a cut, but there was what in Mafia terms, Russian Mafia terms, called obshak. Just like in Italian Mafia, there's a common pot. If you're made in the Italian Mafia, you don't need to, in fact, you don't make your own money. Everything you make belongs to the family, right? And if you're a man and anything happens to you, the family has a responsibility to take care of widows and orphans, right? That's how the American insurance business got started. So, Hartford, Connecticut. And Putin was very much involved in this kind of interaction. I go into a lot of detail on it in the book, but one of the things that's very important to remember is that Zola Tov. Zola Tov was in charge of Putin's personal protection and Sobchak's. And when Putin then went to Moscow and became president in 2000, anybody see the videos on YouTube of the inauguration of Putin in 2000 or any of the inaugurations? It's like an amazingly, wonderfully, high production film. Every single detail is just so great. You know, if you're a film buff, it's really worth watching. So you have, you know, the entire Kremlin filled, all the great halls of the Kremlin filled with all their guilds and everything, and all these, you know, wonderful, tall, looking exactly the same men in their uniforms, waiting to open the door, the gilded door for Putin. They open it up, and Putin emerges like chrysalis, like as if you're in a Russian Orthodox church, you know, out from behind the iconostasis, and goes up and gets inaugurated. He's inaugurated, he's now president. He turns to go back, but this time he's not alone. Zola Tov is with him. And he becomes Putin's personal bodyguard for the first 14 years, from 2000 to 2014, to last summer. He was Putin's personal bodyguard. And then last summer, Zola Tov was made by Putin the first deputy minister of interior. Zola Tov is now in charge of all riot police in Russia. So if there's a threat to the regime, it's Zola Tov. And if there's a threat to Putin, I mean, it's now that the concern is not, is there going to be a Ronald Reagan style situation where a single shooter tried to assassinate the president. Now if there are, you know, a whole campus that goes out, now it's the riot police, Oman, who are going to go in. So Zola Tov is still around, and he was there from the very beginning. And there's a whole circle of people who were with Putin, some of them liberal economists who went with him to Moscow, some of them KGB people, a lot of the KGB people that he worked with before, either in Dresden or because he was stationed in Germany, or in Leningrad, St. Petersburg. They all ended up going either before him or with him or just after him to Moscow. And the business people also have remained very important. Now, let's talk a minute about Moscow. So, in 1996, Sobchak lost the mayoral election. Putin worked for Sobchak. So all of those people who worked for Sobchak suddenly didn't have a job. So what were they going to do? They all tried to get into Moscow. Because it was a promotion, I mean, it's a country in which there are two very important cities, but Moscow is the capital. And also because the person who had defeated Sobchak didn't want anything to do with Putin or any of that group. So they were really pushed out, including a lot of the Mafia people, even though this guy was plenty of Mafia, but they weren't Putin's people. So Putin went to Moscow, and he stayed in Moscow from 1996 until 2000, and it's quite astonishing. He was in, from 1996 until 2000, so mid-96, they lost the election. He started to go to Moscow, and he didn't have a job. He literally did not have a job. He had to beg people for a job. And 3.5 years later, he was president. I mean, that is it. Just think about that. I mean, it's like even better than Ted Cruz, right? I mean, just imagine. I mean, Ted Cruz, all these guys who are going to run against Washington, who are living, 3 blocks from Mass Avenue in DC, they're all insiders. But Putin actually was an outsider. He was really an outsider and an unemployed one. And Sobchak was certainly not in a position to help him because Sobchak had to flee to France for corruption charges. So he worked his way up, and in 1998, despite the fact that he had been, at the height of his career, only a lieutenant colonel in the KGB, he was made head of its successor. I mean, it's inconceivable in really any country that someone who is a mid-level, at most, mid-level officer would jump over everybody else and become the head. I mean, this is an organization with an extremely, I mean, we may hate them, but it actually has an extremely proud history of being Chekists from the time of Lenin. So there actually is evidently a rule that only generals, people of the rank of general, can become head of the FSB. It's the successor to the KGB. Some people say he broke rules, but I mean, who cares? I mean, that's not the main point. The main point is that politically, he had the power to do it. He had the power to become the head of the FSB in 1998, having been, at that point, only 18 months in Moscow. So he had some enormous, what they would say in Russian, krisha, or roof, over him, pulling him along, helping him, watching out, so forth, from the kind of veteran KGB people who then became quite supportive of, what he was going to achieve when he was elected in 2000. There are all these books that started to flood into the bookstores by, ex-KGB generals from collapse to rebirth, Andropov to Putin. I mean, this kind of book, seeing the KGB, this connection between the KGB that was humiliated and Putin that's going to put the country back on the right track. So Putin in 1998 became head of the FSB, and then things really started to change. He really started to shape the personnel choices in Moscow. Lots of people who were part of the St. Petersburg, especially these people, St. Petersburg clans were moving up. They were taking over all the deputy positions in the FSB. They were moving into the government, and he had extremely good support politically. Then, now I'm going to answer your question. Then the question is, what happened between 1998 and 2000 to make Yeltsin want him? Because, you can be head of the FSB, but that's not the same as saying you're going to be prime minister and then president. So what happened with Yeltsin? Well, so Yeltsin was the head of was the president at the time, and this was an era of oligarchy and corruption. It didn't start with Putin, that's for sure. And one of the big oligarchs was a guy called Boris Berezovsky. And there was a big scandal that broke out in 1999, which involved revelations that millions and millions of dollars was fraudulently stolen, including World Bank loans to Russia, and taken out of the country by businessmen and deposited in the Bank of New York. So they put it right under our nose. They didn't even take it to Cyprus or the British Virgin Islands. They put it in one of the oldest banks in the United States, the Bank of New York, where there worked somebody who was one of my former students, Natasha Gorfinkel, and she was married to the head of the Russian World Bank office, Havighurst. So there was a lot of inside stuff going on, but at the end of the day, they had this scandal with the Bank of New York that involved Berezovsky and Yeltsin and others, and they also had absolutely solid evidence that Yeltsin's two adult daughters, one of whom was politically very powerful, had almost no limit credit cards issued on a Swiss bank. So they were able to buy anything that they wanted and nobody would ask any questions. And this evidence was pretty tight. So tight that when the Attorney General, called in Russia the Procurator General, started to work with the Swiss to bring in this case and to, they launched it and they were going to cooperate. The FSB, headed by Vladimir Putin, launched a sting operation on the Attorney General in which the television showed somebody who resembled the Attorney General naked having sex with two prostitutes. So they just ruined him rather than face up to what had really happened. And here's the answer to the question. Why did Yeltsin name Putin? The answer to the question was because Putin was willing to absolutely do what was required to promote his career, to get the Attorney General, who he had his own reasons to get, and because this Attorney General was also investigating his own corruptions in Petersburg, so it was a win-win for Putin, and to show how loyal he was. He'll do anything for Yeltsin and for Berezovsky. And why Berezovsky is important? Because Berezovsky is, a rich guy who spoke English, was seen in the United States government. This is the Clinton administration as a bit of a pain in the backside, but nevertheless, had great influence. And in 1999, in the fall of 1999, Berezovsky arrives in Washington, D.C., and has a meeting in the White House in which he assures them that the new Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin, is a real Democrat. But Berezovsky didn't care anything about Putin's democratic credential. What he wanted is protection for his own theft. So, it's sad to say, but I think that American naivete was very deep, and I think that's gone now. But at that time, they really wanted Russia to succeed. They really felt that Russia was on the democratic path and that this was the answer. And I'm going to stop there, but I'm going to, just by way of conclusion, talk about one single document that I found that's quite interesting. So one document that I found was a document that was leaked from the Kremlin and then was the subject of 3 days of newspaper articles in the beginning of 2000, before Putin formally became president. And this document then disappeared. It was scrubbed from the internet, and I was able to find it and talked about it extensively in my book, and then I translated it, and it's on the website for my for the book, which is on the Havighurst Center's website. This document is a plan for dismantling, let's call it democracy, for dismantling open government. It is very detailed, and it's got the work schedule for every single department, every single office of the presidential administration of the Kremlin. And it makes a distinction between the open functions, what the public is going to think that you're doing, and the actual functions. The actual functions. So, for example, it says, if Putin really, or if the new president, and this is the quote, really wants to ensure social order and stability in the country during his rule, then the self-governing political system, what we call democracy, is not needed. This is in a document. Instead, he will need a political authority that will create the necessary political situations in Russia and near abroad. All the special and secret activities to counteract the opposition will be entirely in the hands of the special forces, in other words, the security services. Opposition media outlets will be driven to financial crisis, and it's necessary always to ruin the coordinated plans of all opposition in general and each oppositionist personally. And I think, without going into any detail on what's happened in Russia for the last 2 months, but clearly the Putin administration, from the beginning of 2000, was involved in a fight with the opposition to keep them out of the political space and to minimize the political space until we had the murder of Nemtsov in February. I mean, without saying who did that, who ordered it or anything, but clearly the result is that everybody who is a member of the opposition knows that here is somebody in the name of Boris Nemtsov who was murdered in the shadow of the Kremlin, who was a deputy prime minister. And the message is, anybody can be killed at any moment, anywhere. And so this effort to close political space was something that was there with Putin from the very beginning. Thanks. I'm happy to take your questions.
So questions, and so we can preserve this, please do. Use of the microphone.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Andrew Bowen. I'm a PhD candidate here in political science at BC. I wanted to ask your opinion. You talk about Viktor Zola Tov and kind of his continuation as sort of in control of the physical muscle in a certain way, at least now in charge of the Interior Ministry troops. I wanted to get your opinion on the sort of financial muscle, the control over the compromat and the financial corruption that he was, as you mentioned, kind of brought in to ensure that no investigations were brought against Yeltsin and the family. What role does Rosfin monitoring and Viktor Zhukov, in your view, play in maintaining control over the elite?
Yeah. So Viktor Zhukov was someone definitely from St. Petersburg, very close to Putin. They were close to each other, I would say. Someone who had a background in agriculture and was, some people say, it has been alleged that it was Zhukov who delivered the land upon which the Ozero Dacha cooperative was built. And that land, which is on a very nice location next to the lake up there northeast of St. Petersburg. I mean, it wasn't original forest. People had to be kicked out of that land and then turned over to Putin and his buddies who built this, let's call it gated community with private protection. So Zhukov is somebody who's very involved with Putin and involved in one specific way too. Putin and he overlap in their agreement in the use of taxes as a weapon for squeezing. So that's why the financial monitoring is a real, very important aspect of Putin's power. Because he's not, no political leader who's strong wants to go out and start killing people. That's actually a sign that you're losing it. Sign that you have strength is that you can use many more instruments of the state. And one of the instruments that they use, which is wielded by Zhukov, is taxes, state raiding in a way, making either Russian companies or foreign companies whom they want to squeeze out of the market realize that they simply are not going to be able to survive in the market, not just through taxes, but through endless over-regulation, all kinds of inspections, health inspections, fire inspections, one after the other, after the other, after the other. And there are quite a few cases of foreign companies, including IKEA, who've said that they're going to get out of the Russian market unless this kind of retribution ends. So, yeah, it's a very important part of Putinism, I would say.
Yes, I think the gap that I still have in my understanding it has to do with that period 96 to 98. If he shows up in Moscow in 96 without a job, how does he get from there to head of the FSB by 98? He must have a couple of intermediate steps, and you mentioned a roof or something over him, somebody protecting him, but what does he actually do for that 18 months or whatever length it is?
Well, the first job that he had was working for the Kremlin Property Management Office. Now, imagine we're sitting in the Soviet Union and everything is state-owned. Well, who owns it? The Kremlin owns it. Or the Kremlin can at least the Kremlin is the ace in anybody's hand. That you think that you own that building, that it's yours to occupy and use and to lend out to your friends in St. Petersburg. Well, what if somebody arrives from Moscow and says, actually, Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin, he wants to use it as a federal building for meeting state visitors to St. Petersburg, which happened actually on many occasions. So this is what Putin did. Putin got a job as the deputy head of the property management, when the first job that he got when he went there. And so all of that Soviet property, which is the most valuable thing in mid-1990s Russia, how to get property, he had access to it. So you want to come and live in Moscow, you need an apartment. He can give you an apartment. So it was a way to really build a lot of credibility and networks to move into Moscow. There's other aspects to it too, but we won't go into, which had to do with Yeltsin. And then he went on to a position in the Central Control Administration. So all the documents that were, all the investigations that were happening or had happened in St. Petersburg in the 1990s, all of them were like Marina Salier, the food stuff. All of those documents were in that office, and no one has been able to find them since. So I assume that he got rid of them. So he used his time well, very well, for sure.
This question back here on the
Thank you.
So I remember reading The Economist that the reason Cambridge University Press didn't publish your book was that essentially they were scared, if I'm remembering that correctly. What exactly were they scared of?
Well, I make the argument that Putin was connected to the Mafia. I mean, I think it's a perfectly reasonable argument that they didn't. See, the difference is, and this is the difference between laws in Britain and laws in the United States. in Britain, the repetition of statements that could be libelous are, I mean, I have 2,000 footnotes in this book. That, for the British, is irrelevant. Because if those 2,000 footnotes, if 2 of them are libelous, they can take the whole book down. And that actually has happened in many, many cases in the UK. The only way to prove truth in the UK is in a court of law. And it would be up to me as the defendant to prove truth. So you have many of these guys using what's called libel tourism to go after books. This is not just books about Russia, but also books about Ukrainian oligarchs, books about Saudi funding for Al-Qaeda. They have gone to UK courts. Even when, there's a famous case, Alms for Jihad, there was an American author who published a book that was only published in the United States, it was not published in the UK, about Saudi funding for Al-Qaeda. The Saudis, whom she named, took it to court, and they won in the UK because 27 copies of the book had been bought over the internet in the UK. So my publisher also is not publishing in the UK and is absolutely not going to ship anything to the UK or do anything in the UK. It's changed a little bit, the laws are a little bit better, but they don't have First Amendment protection. First Amendment, it turns out, is what makes this conversation possible. This conversation doesn't happen in the UK.
Hello, my name is James Miller. I'm actually the managing editor for a magazine called The Interpreter that covers current events in Russia. And what sort of blows me away with this story, but also looking at current events in Russia, is that I feel like Putin is always given the benefit of the doubt. And this I don't understand, because the sort of the factual evidence never supports giving Putin the benefit of the doubt on anything. So I'm sort of fascinated by, even going back to the Yeltsin era, why, Boris Berezovsky, who just been killed, wrote an op-ed in supporting Putin's appointment. Washington sort of praised his appointment. How did that happen? Because it seems so transparent. Maybe it's just the lens of history, but it seems so transparent now to us, looking back, that this was probably inevitable.
It's of course a great question. And so there are splits within Russian opinion about Putin at that time. There are those who were leaders of the dissident community, the Russian intelligentsia, who said, this guy's KGB, and that means something to us. He will never be anything different. They had experience with being repressed by KGB in the 60s and 70s. They believe it's a mentality. These people are very professionally shaped, and that Putin is no different. Yevgenia Albets, for example, right? She never accepted Putin. But a lot of people, and Boris Berezovsky is a good example. He was never a dissident. He was not working like that for the regime. He's not a KGB guy. He was a physicist by training. He had 60 papers published. He became somebody who was very practical and believed in, putting in a non-corrupt regime. And I think for him, that was the hope of Putin, that he would do something about Yeltsin and Berezovsky and the daughters, especially one daughter, that he would put a stop to that. He seemed like a technocrat. And he was of the next generation. He was of Nemtsov's generation, more or less. So I mean, it is possible, even today, to have a big discussion in the West about Putin. But in 2000, I would say I knew more people who were in favor of him than who were against. And of course, all of them have turned, and all of them have said it's a huge mistake that was made. But at the time, it wasn't the case. I mean, he was, after all, he had all of these people on his side, Chubais, Kudrin, I mean, all of the liberal economists, Illarionov worked for him for 5 years. So, and they were coming and negotiating with the World Bank, and negotiating with the IMF, and talking about, all the things that they were doing, and they were getting a lot of privatization legislation through. I mean, I don't know if there are any libertarians here, but if you were a libertarian, you would love Russia in 2000. They instituted a 13% flat tax. So, Rand Paul and all of that. And they put in place privatization legislation that Yeltsin had not been able to do. So they were doing all of this stuff, and they had a lot of people who were really involved in the decorative democracy side of it, as well as, real privatization. But it was only part of what they were doing. That's what we didn't realize. It was only a small part. I love the magazine.
So at this point, how do we rein in the end? Is it possible? Are sanctions the way? Militarily? Is there any hope?
It's a big country. You can't, Russia is not a country that you can hope to rein in militarily. I'm a big follower of and supporter of the sanctions. And, the reason why I support the sanctions is because the sanctions demonstrate how deep the damage has been by this corruption to our own financial institutions. Not just from Russian corruption. 1/2 of the world's economy is in the black. 1/2. And so the idea of sovereign state response to this is extremely problematic. I mean, all that money, all of these bankers have their arms open wide. And they're all lobbying to not, the city of London is catatonic about the idea of having really specific sanctions against Russian money. And of course, Cyprus too. Many areas. So that's a use of soft power which is so significant. And the thing is, it's not just increasing Russia's power, but it's really what it's doing is weakening the West's ability to respond. Because you really do need your bankers. It's very difficult to impose sanctions, economic sanctions, if the bankers aren't going to help you find the money, and they're hiding it themselves. And I don't know if any of you are interested in this, but of course, now that I'm going to get a visa to Russia, I've started to work on this aspect a lot. And there's this system called SWIFT, right? It's the means by which all money flows. You write a check, you have a credit card transaction, it gets taken out of your account through the process of SWIFT. It's a financial services. And there was talk for a while about sanctioning Russia from using SWIFT. And then, all of a sudden in DC, people were saying, oh, wait a second, the Swiss are saying, or there's rumors coming out of Switzerland, that the Swiss, or certain banks in Switzerland, like HSBC, are working with the Russians to build an alternative to SWIFT. And that's something we really don't want, because all the financial institutions in the world that we care about are controlled by the West. And if we lose that, imagine half of the world's economy being controlled by Bitcoin. It's the same idea, right? You don't know what the rules are, you don't know how the money's moving, you can't find it, you can't target it, you can't see it move. You can see everything within SWIFT, but you can't, and all these alternative things. So it's a real, what Russia, of course Chinese are doing it too, but what Russia is doing is really weakening Western financial controls. And it's really dangerous.
So what do we do?
Hope Ukraine succeeds. Help build Ukraine. I mean, all of this sanctions is because of Ukraine. And if they end up failing despite all of this, which, let's face it, it's 50-50 chance because their corruption is probably worse than Russia's, then I just don't think we stand a chance. I mean, Europe is already becoming very bifurcated. There's lots of problems with South and Southeastern Europe in terms of their interest in staying in the EU. And Russia is doing a lot of things with right-wing all throughout Europe. I think it's just a huge challenge. It's the biggest challenge we face. Of course, we're, destroying the Middle East one city at a time from the air in the meantime, which evidently is supposed to work. So all of this stuff, we're doing a bad job. Bad job. I don't know what we do. I mean, I know that's a real cop-out, but I really don't know. I don't know.
It's my second question, so if anyone hasn't asked their first one, please. But I just wondered how you think about possible succession in a state like the Russia that you describe. It sort of reminds, this KGB cabal sort of reminds me of the Politburo of times past in a certain sense. These shadowy figures behind the scenes are controlling everything. But do you have any thoughts about how to assess that? I mean, Putin might be in power for many years to come, but how do you analyze the future possibilities?
So the difference between the Politburo and today is that I wrote a book on the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the 68 invasion of Czechoslovakia, Kremlin decision making, and I at least knew, the Politburo is meeting every Thursday afternoon. There are these people on it. There is a structure. There's full members and there's alternate members. Somebody gets promoted, you know about it. They're standing in an order. There's an elaborate signaling of status within the Soviet Politburo, as far as the public, right? There isn't. There's only one person that matters, and that's Putin. So there's a lot of discussion about who are the 5 people who Putin is now taking calls from. So this kind of closing, which suggests that he's not talking to as many people, his circle is not as wide as it used to be. And that's, of course, of great concern because the smaller the decision-making circle, the worse the decision. The Soviet decision to invade Afghanistan was made by 3 people in a drunken New Year's Eve party. Actually, the first Chechen War was started the same way. So the smaller the decision-making unit, the worse the decision. And I think that for me, that's my own view about where he was for 10 days. That he didn't know who had killed Nemtsov. He himself didn't know. And the question was, is it a faction? Was it really Chechens? Was it the Ukrainians? Was it the CIA? Was it the FSB? Was it the MVD? I mean, who was it? And so just trying to figure it out. And the first time that he reappears, and he was at a meeting at the Collegium of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and he gave a talk there, and he mentioned Boris Nemtsov's death, as he said, in the shadow of the Kremlin. He said it himself. And the look on his face, he was so clearly shaken, so nervous. It was as if he was scanning the crowd as if he was looking for a shooter. I mean, he looks completely, for a moment, he completely lost control. And I think it's a very tough situation for him. I mean, I have no sympathy for him. But it's a very tough situation when you find yourself in that corner. You know, you can talk all you want about the need not to corner leaders, but who did that, right? I mean, I don't buy the argument that the West did this to him. So there's a logic of this regime, and that's what will happen. It will not end well for him, whether it'll be sooner or later. We don't know.
All right, so that, I think, is the last word, and why don't we thank our speaker, Alicia Belchois.